Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. We continue our operation. My name is Olga Atamanova, and today is day 356 of the full-scale invasion of the Russian aggressor in our land. And I want to thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about this war. I want to introduce our speaker today. It's Rustemov, the Mufti of Crimea, head of the spiritual administration of Muslims of Crimea. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's been almost a year of the full-scale invasion. So how the religious community changed within this year? What are the challenges they're facing and how does it live now? Well, first of all, we are not just the spiritual administration. It should be understood for all our audience. We are the spiritual administrations of the Muslims of Crimea, and we are the only religious institution of the indigenous people of Ukraine. And we want to thank Mr. President Zelensky and his team. As the legal entity, we were created back in 2017, but again, I want to emphasize that we are a religious institution. It's important to understand in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, Russian war, which really started in Crimea back in 2014, not in 2022. And that's why we represent the adherents of our religion both in Crimea and on the mainland Ukraine. As to the life of our communities after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, the life goes on. Many families left, many of our adherents left, but our communities, especially in the central and western part of mainland Ukraine, but if we count all the community, not only in the mainland, but it's 22 communities in total, they continue their statutory activities. We continue to operate in a normal manner. Obviously, the occupation had its aftermath. If we talk about, say, Kherson and Zaporizhia region, the activities in the occupied areas are impossible, but I keep emphasizing that the religious life is not just life in the temple. Even if the mosques are destroyed, we will continue doing what we're doing. We will continue our fight until the very end, until Ukraine's victory, until there is justice. So the religious life and spiritual life is, first of all, as I always say, is the fight for the minds and hearts of the people. That's why we keep working. Of course, the full-scale invasion had its results, had its consequences. For example, talking about the holidays that we had to celebrate during war. It was not as good as it was before the big full-scale invasion. If we take, for example, Kurban Bayram, when we used to give away the meat to regular adherents during war, we decided to make a sauteed meat, and only to give away this sauteed meat to our guys from the armed forces, because halal meat is very demanded there in the front lines. It's just one example. We had one Ramadan in these conditions of war. For example, in Kyiv and Kyiv region, we have 4 mosques. However, on the peak in March, May, when Russians were in the outskirts of Kyiv, we closed 3 of them because almost all the civilians especially women and children, were evacuated to Turkey mostly. Many families left to Europe, and the men who were left here, I was here too. We decided to maintain our resistance with what we can. Everybody did whatever they were able to do. We left our only mosque in Kyiv region. It was in the very front line of the clashes. As everybody knows, the Russians almost reached Stoyanka in Zhytomyr, on the Zhytomyr highway, and this is where we spent our Ramadan. We were standing there. Our guys kept resistance. They were keeping repelling the enemy attacks. We were feeding the territorial defense forces. Humanitarian aid was provided. We involved all the organizations in this process. Everybody who we worked with previously, DNet, IHH, we were baking bread and giving away to people in the cities and in the outskirts. What's interesting, we were able, but back then the banking system was still operating, so we were able to transfer funds to the occupied territories, to Kherson region, so that people could buy some food there to give away to those in need. It was in Genishevsk and in Novakhovka districts, and thanks God we were able to make it. So this is how we were working. It's important also to emphasize the work in the information front, the information activities, because we have to take note that Russian propaganda works very efficiently in the Muslim world, and many Muslims, they keep saying, many Muslims all around the world, they keep saying that's not a war of the Muslims, it's a war against one Christian country against the other Christian country. So you have to remain neutral, because we don't know if there are any Muslims involved in there, and it's a big matter. We keep explaining that there are Muslims here, at least 4 spiritual administrations of Muslims. I'm not even talking about other Muslim organizations, because there are lots of other civil Muslim organizations which are registered as civil organizations. So there is a big Muslim community, and we protect our homeland. We keep explaining that Russia are the conquerors, that there is no NATO here, they just try to invade us. So it's a tremendous job we're trying to do. After every shelling of Kyiv, after every missile strike on Kyiv, I'm being contacted by Turkish mass media for comments. They ask me what's going on over there on your end, what's the situation over there, and I have to explain all of it and things like those. Yeah, well, getting back to the topic of occupied Crimea, we understand that it's Crimean Tatars who suffer the most oppression, and we know about the multiple facts of violation of human rights and freedoms in the temporarily occupied territories. So do you have any opportunity to stay in touch with them, to support our Ukrainians over there, and do you have any options to help them with, for example, evacuation or otherwise? Yes, we stay in touch, but it's difficult to say it's a strong connection, because it's been 9 years, and we understand that with every year when I was preaching to Crimea, I was preaching that Crimea will be liberated. People did not believe in that, honestly. But I kept saying, even when I was elected Mufti in 2017, when I said that just as Mecca was opened by the Prophet, in the same way, inshallah, Crimea will be opened. And after 8 years, the things began that we are witnessing now. And those adherents who did not believe me back then, they say, yeah, Aidarjan, you were right. Crimea will be liberated. And now everybody believes it. So there is connection, but it's not so strong. As to the support, it's more like an advice, consultation, not more than that. We cannot do anything there physically, but it's utmostly important for us to understand that Crimean Tatars, the indigenous people of Ukraine, by the way, what Putin said, that this law is the weapon of mass destruction of weapons, of elimination of Russians in Crimea. That was his comment. That Crimean Tatars, the Muslims in Crimea, I mean the indigenous Muslims of Ukraine, are the resistance of Ukrainian state in Crimea. If we say about liberation of Crimea further on, about the future of Ukrainian Crimea, I used to say, and I keep saying, that the repressions were on, and they are still on, and they will only increase, they will only grow in their scale, because Russia clearly understands that moment that Crimean Tatars are the resistance. We all remember 26th of February, after the 24th of February, after the beginning of the invasion, of the Crimean Tatars went out in the streets, and we know all those things about Hizb ut-Tahrir. We have at least 89 political prisoners in different categories, 89 persons imprisoned with no good reason. So Russians understand it all, and they understand that the resistance will continue. So you remember Jamil Gafarov died in prison. It was on the 10th of February. Our compatriot died in prison because he was not treated properly in prison. And they got some very long sentences for civil actors. Ustem Shaykhalilov, Usman Alib Kametov, I know them privately. We made a Hajj together back in the day. The Akhtimov brothers, who were convicted for 13, 15 years, though some absolutely savage sentences, and Russians will keep doing that. So you mentioned the information war by Russian Federation, by propaganda, which is spread it all around the world. What's your evaluation? How did the attitude of the Muslims from other countries, including, say, Turkey, how did it change towards everything that the Russian propaganda is trying to impose? We understand that in the beginning of 2014, they were very influential. So does it still work now? So talking about the Muslim world, talking specifically about Muslims, there are positive changes probably, but again, I emphasize it remains. It's like a background thing. Russia was helping Arabian states in their so to say countering Israel, and there is this logic that enemy of the enemy is the friend. So we have to keep explaining them. So we have to keep explaining that we Muslims, we are indigenous people of Ukraine, in the people of occupied Crimea, the homeland of Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars are the Muslims, and if the invader comes to your house and they try to kill you, they kidnap people, what you gonna do? There are positive changes, but we need to keep reminding about it. We need to keep talking about this. So if there are any questions on the floor, please go ahead. Valentina Rengel, Ukrinform. I have a question. A little while ago, the imams are being persecuted in Crimea by the Russians. So if you can give us a little bit more detail about that. Well, imams are being persecuted in Crimea since 2014. Imams were persecuted in Crimea back from those times, but I don't know if there are any imams still left there. Yes, they used to persecute imams there, but we have to understand that the religious organization over there, the spiritual administration of the Muslims of Crimea, which is illegitimate, which became collaborationist administration, is just a puppet. Just a puppet using which the occupational government does whatever they want. For example, a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, what they did, they started disconnecting the mosques from electric power supply, from water supply, in just before the Ramadan, only because those mosques were independent. They refused to submit to occupational administrations, which is represented by that collaborationist mosque or collaborationist organization I'm talking about. And another example about what was going on in Crimea, the events in Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. We have a lot of communities there in Kherson region, and there is no single head of the community which would not have been searched. The example of Rustemov, who gave an open interview, who was tortured in Henishevsk high school. It's infamous high school that the activists with an active civil position were pulled through. The head of Kherson community also went through that administration. He was put a bag on his head, he was beaten, and he was asked whether he is related to Azov, whether he was attending the pro-Ukrainian meetings, are they related to the spiritual administration of Crimean Muslims, are they related to Majlis of Crimean Tatars. They're being beaten with the handcuffs, and then the people are forced to sign the document on cooperation. Well, getting back to the full-scale invasion, with the full-scale invasion, we understand that many adherents crossed the borders of our country. They found shelter in European countries and other countries. So how do you maintain the connections with them? Well, we maintain the connection, but it becomes weaker, it fades, unfortunately, because they are already there, they start integrating. There is still connection, and thanks God that connection is positive. Sometimes, for example, one of our imams, he works in a Hamburg mosque, and he helps us to arrange ties with the local communities over there. Dear friends, do you have any questions left? If so, please go ahead. Well, we have no more questions on the floor. We appreciate this conversation. If you have any more important comments that we omitted, please. Yes, I have a couple of words to say. One of the areas that we as a religious institutions, as the spiritual administration of Crimean Tatars, one of the areas we work with, we understand that the way we're going as the Ukrainians, together with all the Ukrainians as Crimean Tatars, we understand it clearly that it's a single way, and we try to strengthen ties with the Muslims in Europe. It's a part of religious diplomacy which has a lot of goals. For example, increase of humanitarian help coming into Ukraine. One of such examples is the mobile field kitchen. We will try to launch this project within a couple of days or maybe weeks to feed people in Kherson, because the situation is difficult there, and if God allows, in other cities as well. So this is one of the areas areas of our work I would like to mention about. We know that the representatives of many religious communities, they work and they go to the areas of active warfare, and I'm sure there are representatives of your communities in those areas. Could you tell us a few words about that work too? Yes, after the adoption of the law on chaplains, there was an award upon my submission, a word of the heads of our communities who were doing different activities during that difficult period in Kyiv region, in Lusk region, in Volyn region. It's the Lusk community, and there was a unity of chaplains. In Muslim language, they are called imams. There are some difficulties to get them enlisted in the ranks of the armed forces. It depends on the diplomas or some other bureaucratic procedures. In fact, we have one chaplain, Sheikh Suleiman, very respected person. In fact, he already works there, and even I have an intention sometimes, because it's difficult given my status and the nature of my activities, I mean, to go there, but I still have such intention, and we will continue working in that area too. Thank you very much for this conversation. Aider Rustemov, Mufti of Crimea, head of the spiritual administration of Muslims of Crimea. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us. Right now, our team is working on the schedule for tomorrow. Follow our announcements, trust in our armed forces, and work together for the victory. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Thank you.